I'm trying to recover and understand the place of early modern science in Shakespeare's dramas. In the past several years, Shakespeare scholars have started to notice a lot of references to early modern science, or to natural philosophy, which is how he would have known the term, in his plays and poetry. The topics are quite far-ranging. Some people notice the biological allusions. He seems to be engaged with the changes in the understanding of human anatomy that have come with the Italian Renaissance and the shift from Galen to Vesalius. He also seems to be interested in the emergence of human dissection, which is a new phenomenon, again in Renaissance Italy. Some scholars notice his engagement with physics, particularly with Lucretian atomism, and his interest in matter. They notice that he's interested in questions about divisibility, especially divisibility of invisible things. Some people notice that he seems to be interested in mathematical ideas that are circulating at his time, particularly the emergence of the zero, which comes with the advent of algebra and Arabic numerals in England. And other people notice his engagement with astronomy. He seems to be interested in Copernican astronomy and, as I hope to show you tonight, in the work of Tycho Brahe. So what I'm also going to do tonight is talk more generally about Shakespeare's awareness of science in the context of two of his plays, in Hamlet and in King Lear, and offer some interpretive remarks, which I think is the more fun activity, the interpretive remarks to explain the meaning of these allusions for his poetic works. In the context of Hamlet, I'll talk about how he's interested in Copernican astronomy and also broadly in early modern empiricism. And in the context of King Lear, I'll talk about the play's engagement with new forms of nothingness and with atomism. I think that when we begin to recognize that Shakespeare was quite knowledgeable of science, we start to see a few things. I think we see that he had a profound understanding of the philosophical questions surrounding from the emergence of new scientific ideas and new theories. And I think that when we see this, I think it's safe to say that he looks something like a philosopher of science. I think we also start to see that Shakespeare's understanding of science helps us see the way that we interact with science in our own times. I think the world that Shakespeare was engaged in was exciting scientifically and also uncertain scientifically in ways that resemble our own time. So I think when we turn to Shakespeare in this way, we can start to see how poets can help us live well with scientific change. So let's start with Hamlet. When I say that Hamlet is a play that is engaged with Copernican astronomy and theories about empiricism, I do not mean to say that this is the basis for an entire interpretation of the play. I think it is something that informs the play and deepens our understanding, but my point is not to say that this will completely revolutionize and change how we understand Hamlet. I think it will deepen our understanding. Generally speaking, I read Hamlet as a tragedy about a deeply contemplative man who's challenged to take revenge and play out the role of a hero in something like a traditional revenge plot. His challenge is framed by a context of cosmological and theological conflicts of appearance that obsess his mind and shape his actions. Again, astronomy and empiricism are in the midst of these conflicts, but they aren't the only ones. I think that if we just turn to the various settings of the play, we can start to see the theological and cosmological fault lines that underlie Hamlet. The most obvious association comes from the placement of Hamlet at school in Wittenberg. Wittenberg, of course, is the seat of the Protestant Reformation. It's where Luther posts his 95 Theses and where disputes about the existence or non-existence of purgatory begin to take place. We also, I think, can see some references to the Protestant Reformation with respect to Denmark itself, since Denmark was a state that had recently, when Shakespeare was writing, become a Protestant state. That was in 1536. So in the background, I think the broad fault lines are the disputes, the theological questions about the nature, especially about the nature of the afterlife that come from the Protestant Reformation. I think the Danish setting is also a reference to Tycho Brahe's Denmark. I think this comes through especially when we recognize the proximity of Elsinore to Tycho Brahe's famous Uraniborg Observatory, which was built in 1576 by the Danish king Frederick II. Tycho Brahe was a famous astronomer for being a Copernican in part, or at least someone who entertained the Copernican view, and eventually came up with a model of the heavens that combined both of these different perspectives. Now, when I start to say that Hamlet is a play that is grounded, somebody says, "Oh no, alarm." When I start to say that, alarm, there may be trouble here. When I start to say that Tycho Brahe's Denmark is relevant for Hamlet, I'm opening up what is a fairly heated historical debate about how far Shakespeare was aware of Copernican astronomy. It's not my intention here to go into a lot of historical detail. This is not a history talk. My intention is to offer interpretive remarks primarily. But I think that if I give you a little bit of a taste for the historical evidence for Shakespeare's familiarity with Copernicus, I think it will help us buttress my case. One of the funny things about doing work on Shakespeare and trying to understand whether he was influenced by certain thinkers is that we have very little historical evidence to work with. We can look at the texts. So if we're trying to figure out, for example, if Shakespeare read Montaigne, we can read the plays themselves and see that he's quoting Montaigne directly in many cases, and we know that he was very familiar with Montaigne for that reason. We aren't so lucky, for the most part, with the evidence for his connection with Copernicus, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about. We don't have a long list of books that he read. We don't have a library. We don't have something like what Darwin left us, which is a list of his books week by week, day by day that he read. So we don't know exactly what he was familiar with. But historians try to reconstruct what he was probably familiar with, at least culturally, and in the circles that he was traveling in. One of the more recent accounts of the science of Shakespeare, and specifically the physics and astronomy of Shakespeare that just came out, was a book called Shakespeare Science by Dan Falk, and I'm drawing, for the most part, on Falk's material here. Falk tells us a few things. He tells us that Shakespeare was familiar with Tycho Brahe in England, and Brahe was very well known in England and around Europe because he was famous, and this is part of the reason why Frederick built his Uraniborg castle for him so that he could continue his astronomical work. James VI visited there in 1590, and in the meantime, England was becoming increasingly familiar with Copernican astronomy through the work of Thomas Digges. Digges was famous for writing the first English translation of Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. And if you have a handout or have someone who will share it with you, you can see that the diagram of Copernicus's model of the universe that Digges publishes in his English translation. What's interesting, I think, for our purposes about that particular diagram is that it's the first place we see a Copernican diagram that refers to an infinite heavens. So Copernicus doesn't have an infinite set of stars surrounding his motion of the planets, but Digges does. And at least in Falk's book and some other Shakespeare scholars speculate that Shakespeare may get the idea of the infinite and incorporate it into his plays from this book, particularly the line we hear in Hamlet, that I may be bounded in a nutshell, but count myself the king of infinite space. So it's a possibility. Another place that I think we see Shakespeare's connection to Tycho Brahe and to the astronomy of his day is in Tycho Brahe's own frontispiece, which he published in one of his own astronomical writings, and I have that frontispiece on the second page of your handout. The clincher on that frontispiece for a lot of people is that the Frontispiece includes a family tree, and Tycho Brahe's family members consisted of 2 people named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So I don't know. That's what I've got. All right. So again, this is not a history talk, but I think that we generally meet with a lot of suspicion, at least in the scholarly world, when we're trying to make the case that Shakespeare was engaged with science. I think that may have something to do with the disciplinary separation, which we're fortunate not to have to accept here. So I think I count myself very lucky that these connections have started to become clear because of our lab and mathematics program here at St. John's. The primary textual evidence that Hamlet is framed by the Copernican Revolution appears in a letter to Ophelia that Hamlet writes and that Polonius reads, which is also on your handout. Hamlet writes the following: "To the celestial and my soul's idol, the most beautified Ophelia, these, in here excellent white bosoms, these, etc. Doubt that the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love." Okay, why is there Copernicanism in this letter? What am I talking about? The Copernican world appears in this letter in a crucial equivocation on the word doubt. We can see this when we realize that when Shakespeare is writing, the word doubt has 2 meanings. One is the meaning doubt in the same way that we use it, and the other meaning is suspect. A couple of scholars have noticed this, Howard Marchitello and Leon Craig, and they suggest that when we run that equivocation through the letter and read it the other way, in one direction, Hamlet's love for Ophelia is true, and he's in a Ptolemaic universe. The other way, Hamlet's love for Ophelia is false, and he is in a Copernican universe. So why does Shakespeare place this cosmological equivocation in a love letter? I think one possibility is that Shakespeare is suggesting that in Hamlet's world, in a world where equivocal things have started to replace undoubtable things, love itself, something deeply psychological, also becomes unstable. I think in the same way that Hamlet's madness is also very difficult to pin down and determine. It's hard to tell when he's mad or when he's feigning madness. It's also very difficult to tell when he is true and in love with Ophelia, and it's not even clear that he knows that himself. When we look at his love for Ophelia and try to pin it down, we see that his love seems to oscillate between 2 views. On the one hand, Ophelia is a celestial being who's to be treated with awe, and on the other hand, she's simply a material being, lusty and beautified as opposed to beautiful, and therefore low and false. When Hamlet gives Ophelia the advice, "Get thee to a nunnery," he also equivocates. Nunnery has the meaning of both a spiritual home for celibate women and also the meaning of a brothel, a place for lusty bodies. So this opposed and double characterization seems to imitate some of the theoretical differences between the Copernican and the Ptolemaic worlds. The Ptolemaic world emphasizes the spiritual perfection of the heavenly spheres, and the Copernican world eventually brings into the possibility that the celestial world is full of imperfection and even physical imperfection. At the close of his letter, Hamlet says that he cannot reckon his groans, and so he can't really find a way between one model over the other. Now, Hamlet, I think, tries to find firmer ground in this equivocal cosmological situation that he's in, but he doesn't go about this by looking at the sky and inventing the telescope to figure out which of these models is true. Instead, he undertakes an investigation of the words of the ghost. He tries to figure out what the ghost is and whether or not he can trust it, and act upon its request to take revenge for his father's murder. When we recall the influence of Wittenberg against the backdrop of the play, we can see that for Hamlet, when he faces the ghost seems to be at least two possible things. On the one hand, the ghost is a spirit from purgatory who speaks the truth and arrives to request the revenge of his murder. On the other hand, the ghost may be a demon, he may be lying, and Hamlet thinks he may be preying on his melancholy, another sign potentially that he's going mad. When Hamlet first meets the ghost, at least in my reading, his response is to temporize. He tells Horatio that he may have to put on an antic disposition because he thinks he may be going mad, and he wants to give himself time to try and figure out what to do. In the time that he does gain for himself, he doesn't simply reflect on the appearance of the ghost, though. He's not just interested in a philosophical question. He wants to figure out a way to test the truth of the ghost, to observe whether it is speaking the truth. He says, I will have grounds more relative than this, grounds more relative than the appearance of the ghost. So he's not willing to take action based on the ghost's word alone. In order to try to figure out what is going on and whether the ghost is speaking the truth, he contrives the mousetrap, the play, in which he's obsessively concerned with what he can verify with his senses. He thinks that he's going to use the play to draw Claudius out for observation. We hear him announce his plan right after the players arrive, and he asks them to perform the murder of Gonzago. He says he's going to add 12 or 16 lines, and then he describes exactly why he wants them to perform this play with the additions. I think I have this quote on your handout. He says the following: I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. I'll observe his looks. I'll tempt him to the quick. If I do blench, I know my course. Hamlet's conclusions from this test, then, are not simply a matter of verifying the ghost's claims. He also wants to determine whether the ghost speaks the truth as a basis for action. The play begins with the dumb show, and the dumb show, of course, presents the murder as the ghost has described it. At this stage of the performance, though, Claudius does not react. It's not until we see the play, the version that combines both audio and visual qualities, that Claudius reacts. But the play is not exactly the same as the dumb show. In the play, the king is murdered by poison in the ear, but in this case, the murder is not the king's brother, but rather his nephew. Since Claudius doesn't react to the dumb show, in which the murder seems to be the one that we hear described by the ghost, but he does react to the play, it's possible that his reaction comes from the fear that the threat implied in the play is actually the threat that Hamlet will murder him. And we've heard him already say that he must watch Hamlet. Madness and greatness in great ones must not unwatched go. Now, despite the potential problems with this experimental theater, Hamlet seems to think, at least at first, that he's nailed it, that the play has ferreted out Claudius. He says that he takes it for £1,000. And he asks Horatio for confirmation, did perceive? And Horatio says he did. Horatio doesn't acknowledge, though, that he is arriving at the same conclusion as Hamlet. So when we do see later that Claudius has been moved by the play, and at least in the soliloquy that follows the scene, we see that he's moved to talk about his guilt. But the play itself does not disclose evidence either way that it has been able to test his heart accurately and to do so publicly. So why does Shakespeare place this ineffective test in the middle of the play? What is he doing? What is he trying to tell us about Hamlet? Why not just have Hamlet produce something that is a little more certain. It's hard to tell. We often don't even notice that the play doesn't really work exactly how it's supposed to work. When we start to notice that the play doesn't quite work in the way that it's supposed to work, we see that the play has a lot of instances of people who are trying to read the hearts and minds of others and may not be doing so very effectively. We can think about Polonius's attempt to draw out, to plant rumors about Laertes in France so that he can test whether people agree with those rumors and know whether his son is getting into trouble. We see Polonius also trying to observe Hamlet and to determine whether he really loves Ophelia. We see the king and queen try to draw out Hamlet with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, which Hamlet resents. And we see Hamlet also fail to read Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He thinks that they smile for a different reason than they do when they come to tell him about the players. So the Danes in this view seem to be somewhat poor at judging people's inward minds from outward appearances, even when they have tests involved. I think Shakespeare also suggests that in Denmark, the senses themselves seem to be corrupted. The play has many, many references to the eyes and the ears, and also how they aren't working in concert with one another. The dumb show and the play are one place where it seems like the visual is separate from the ears. We see this in the opening play where certain characters can see the ghost but not hear the ghost. We hear reference to the ears of the groundlings that will be split. We hear about the mildewed ear that is Claudius. And of course, there's the poisoned ear of Hamlet, of King Hamlet. With respect to eyes, we see that Horatio can see the ghost, but he can't hear him. And we hear over and over people want others to look, and Hamlet insists that Gertrude look on Claudius's portrait and is not seeing correctly. When Hamlet meets with Gertrude in her chamber and he is trying to get her to see Claudius a little bit differently, he actually suggests that her senses are faulty and not working together because her soul is corrupt. "Have you eyes," he says, and he asks her repeatedly to compare her former husband, who he likens to Jove, to this mildewed ear that is the new king. I hope no one ever compares anyone I like to a mildewed ear. Okay, so Hamlet says, here's what Hamlet says to his mother. Your senses must be apoplexed. You have eyes without feeling, feeling without sight, ears without hands or eyes, smelling sends all. She ultimately also comes around to his view. "O Hamlet, speak no more. Thou turn'st my eyes into my very soul, and there I see such black and grained spots as will not leave their tinct." So in this context, Shakespeare entertains the view that the senses can aid in judgment of character, but they must be rooted in a psyche that is not corrupt. Now, I think Shakespeare hints at a few ways that humans may not fail entirely to draw out the inner workings of people's hearts and minds. But Hamlet doesn't seem to find any of his observational tests to be a basis on which he can either act and take revenge or decidedly forbear and admit his ignorance. He laments after he's been excited by the play, he laments that his revenge remains dull. He doesn't want to act on it. And at this point, we see him take up another thread of inquiry, another kind of empirical questioning that he's been interested all along. He's interested in the material nature of the afterlife, what happens to the body after we die. We hear Hamlet talk about this early on in the play, that humans are nothing more than a quintessence of dust. He also speaks of Polonius's diet as a diet for worms, making a nice, interesting, equivocal allusion to the Protestant Reformation in the diet of worms, in which we debate Luther's objections to the Catholic Church. And even in the final scenes of the play, when he's talking with the gravedigger, he's still interested in knowing how long it takes for a man to rot when he lies in his grave. So he's still reaching to look for empirical evidence, to look for material evidence, especially in this context, for what's going on. The trouble, though, is that the ghost is not a material thing, and this line of inquiry doesn't really help him in that respect. Now, near the very end of the play, I think Hamlet kind of gives up on his empirical inquiries, and he seems to take out another tack that seems to be inspired by the model of Fortinbras. All the while that he's been questioning the afterlife and examining the appearances of things, he comments on the valor of Fortinbras, who he describes specifically as a man of action who doesn't appear to struggle with any deliberation about the basis of his warlike actions. His actions are simply spurred by a love of honor. Hamlet may be imitating Fortinbras when he stabs Polonius, when he acts rashly and he just sort of takes that moment, this impulsive move to kill the man behind the curtain. It might also be the case that he does this with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. But he doesn't ultimately take this frame of reference as an inspiration to kill the king. He just doesn't take that next step. By the end of the play, he seems to take a different kind of guidance for his life, and we learn of this when he comes back on the pirate ship to Denmark. He says to Horatio that his action and what has happened to him seems to follow from some kind of providence. As he says, our indiscretion sometimes serves us well when our deep plots do pall, and that should learn us. There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. A few lines later, when Horatio warns him that if he walks into a sword fight with Laertes, he may die, he says there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. And I think this latter quote indicates also that Hamlet is not only thinking that he's being guided by providence, but he's also walking into his own death. So he's now completely given up on the possibility of finding a firm foundation for his actions, at least on the basis of his observations. And he seems to be giving himself over to the actions of others. In this case, it seems almost like he's trying to sort of play out or play a part in the revenge plot of Laertes. But despite the bleakness of his nearly suicidal view, at the end of the play, Hamlet decides not to give himself over to oblivion. At the last moment of his life, when Horatio announces that he will himself commit suicide, Hamlet urges him to stop in order to get Horatio to tell his story and in order to leave the kingdom to Fortinbras. So something has moved Hamlet to be concerned with political continuity and to be concerned with the possibility that his life is recollected. He seems to see something as worth recovering and worth sustaining even in this conflicted world that he's dying in. Hamlet, of course, does not say exactly what his insight is that makes him make this request, but I think it suggests that if we kind of go back and review Hamlet's life, we might be able to see something more in the midst of the situation in which he finds himself. In the recollection of Hamlet's life that is Shakespeare's play, I think we see Shakespeare stage the way in which theoretical uncertainties, whether they're cosmological or theological, unsettle the basis of human action, especially for a thinking man. Shakespeare places a thinking man in the position of a revenge hero and gives us an opportunity to observe this kind of person trying to, with all of his devices, to find a rational basis for heroic action. It seems like Shakespeare is doing an experiment on whether we can have a thinking man in the role of a hero. Shakespeare suggests, I think, that the world of action for thinking actors may require a kind of philosophical courage that's grounded in knowing at least as much about what we do know and can know as knowing what we don't. So at the moment of his death, I think Hamlet seems to move from being a thinking man who has given himself over to providence to a man who sees in the recollection of his life the possibility of a more philosophic perspective. And Shakespeare, in presenting this possibility, I think suggests that the theoretical questions surrounding Hamlet may demand a kind of philosophical reflection to navigate the world. Now, in the space I have remaining, I'm going to turn the page to a different play, to Lear, and talk a bit about a different variation on this same kind of theme, another place where I think we can see Shakespeare engaged with the theoretical world of early modern natural philosophy or science, and where I think, again, that awareness of that part of the play helps us understand it more deeply. When Hamlet turns to what is in the heavens and beneath the earth, Lear, I think, turns to the space in between and into the things that may be in that space, whether that's nothingness or atoms or void or something else. I think Lear is also framed particularly by the ideas of nothingness that come from the atomistic physics of early modernity and from the mathematical emergence of the zero. But again, as was the case with my discussion of Hamlet, when I say Lear is framed by these things, I don't mean to say that they frame an entire comprehensive interpretation. I think they're part of the play that help us understand it more deeply. In the larger context, I read Lear as the tragedy of a man who attempts to command the future of his kingdom, but fails to understand in time the natural and conventional basis on which his kingdom stands. As the play goes on, he starts to investigate the nature of both nature and convention and the inseparable relation between the two. I think that the ideas about nothingness and atomism that shape the play enter into Lear's understanding of nature, and in some cases it seems to be at the root of the way in which he tragically misses the mark. To see how Lear is engaged with atomism and nothing, I think that we can start by looking at the opening scene, where Lear has proposed to divide his kingdom and he stages his infamous love test. So he's planned it already, he's got the division all sorted out in advance, but he then stages this question, and he wants his daughters each to say how much they love him in order to be awarded a section of the land in accordance with their profession of love. Famously, he asks his first two daughters, who offer elaborate responses, and when he turns to his third daughter, Cordelia, third and youngest daughter and most loved daughter, Cordelia, Cordelia replies that she will offer nothing. Lear challenges her to ask again, and again she replies nothing. To which Lear responds, "Nothing will come of nothing." Cordelia again refuses, and the kingdom unravels from there. So we get the tragedy starts to unfold. All right. Why are we interested in this exchange? I think the first hint that we're dealing with a philosophical frame that is concerned with atomism and nothingness in the context of atomism. It appears in Lear's claim that nothing will come of nothing. This claim, of course, stands in direct contrast to the biblical principle creation ex nihilo. And Lear's nothing will come of nothing echoes an opposed doctrine that was increasingly prominent at his time, nihil ex nihilo fit, that out of nothing, nothing comes. This latter doctrine was particularly prominent in the circles that in Shakespeare's time that were associated with atomism, especially with Thomas Harriot, who was known as the English Galileo and who seems to be present in the background of the physics of Lear. Since atomists like Thomas Harriot see atoms as eternal, they don't see a need for an account of creation out of nothing. Now, we get other hints that Lear is engaged with atoms and their counterpart nothingness or void in a lot of other places in the play. And because of time, I won't go through the interpretive meaning of all of these, but I want to just give you a kind of catalog of at least 5 or 6 of them so you get a taste of where we can look in the play for evidence that this kind of theoretical frame is present there. For these instances, I'm particularly indebted to Mary Crane, whose recent book on Lear really opened up the play in this way for me. And the list that I'm giving you is something that she offers herself in a sort of longer, more expanded form. The first thing that Crane points out is that Shakespeare seems to be interested in questions about divisibility of matter and divisibility of invisible things. So in the love test at the beginning of the play, love is an invisible thing treated as a quantity that can be divided. The kingdom is treated as something that can be divided. We also see that many characters are trying to investigate the invisible world by means of different senses than they're usually accustomed to using, and different senses than Shakespeare usually focuses on. The play has a lot of mentions of smell, and smell is one way that we can observe particles that we can't see or touch. So this is one hint that many characters in the play seem to be looking into the world with their noses, with new senses. The heath itself seems to appear like a giant void. As Crane and another scholar named Henry Turner have pointed out, the heath does not actually appear in the stage directions in the folio. It's not a word that appears until 1709. So when Lear goes out into the natural world, it's almost as though he's kind of going out into this void with no name. We also see characters reflecting on the nature of weight. When Gloucester is at Dover with Edgar, so the scene that I'm talking about is where Gloucester has already lost his eyes, and he's decided to go to Dover to commit suicide, and his son, who's disguised as a beggar, is helping him get there. He gets there and he decides he's going to leap, and he doesn't leap, or he does leap, and Edgar describes how he has fallen, but he convinces Gloucester that he hasn't actually fallen and that it's a miracle that he's alive. It's a very bizarre and heart-wrenching scene. It's fascinating to me how Shakespeare can combine tragedy and comedy so poignantly in a single moment. What happens in that context, though, is that Edgar also comments on the weight of falling bodies. He compares Gloucester to a feather that falls, and he speaks as though Gloucester's own sense of his own weight is merely illusory. Somehow, he convinces Gloucester that weight is an illusion. So it seems like, again, Shakespeare is playing with the concept of weight and how it is being called into question when he's writing. The other thing that Shakespeare does is he uses weight as a moral metaphor, and a metaphor to describe the moral weight on our shoulders. So he sort of overlays this scientific sense of weight with the weight of moral things and how that weight can be recalibrated in a time in which civilization is in flux. So in addition to this sort of physics, the physics of King Lear, there's also the mathematics of King Lear. I think that another place we start to see that Lear is engaged with nothingness concerns the way that the zero seems to figure in Lear. One of the things that was happening, as I've mentioned, when Shakespeare was writing that, was that both algebra and Arabic numerals were being introduced to England. And one of the features of that was that the zero was introduced to England for the first time. Imagine reading a book in which the zero is introduced to you. Well, this is what happened for many Englishmen. It came in the form of a book by Robert Record, who wrote a textbook and introduced all of the figures of Arabic numerals. He said there are but 10 figures, but only one signifieth nothing, which is made like an O. Can you imagine? I mean, just reading this and, okay, so I think I find this line just perfect because I think Shakespeare plays with it all over the place. I think that it may even be played with in Hamlet in the name Ophelia. But before I get too carried away on O's in Shakespeare, I'll talk about one way which I think it is strangely present in King Lear. One of the things that has always puzzled me about King Lear is the prevalence of eggs in the play. And I have taught King Lear at other places and have asked many students why they think there are so many eggs in King Lear, and no one has come up with a great answer. But when I read Robert Record's introduction to the Zero, I started to think that perhaps Shakespeare is mapping a zero onto this other thing that is shaped like a zero. So this is my indulgence for the evening, and I will explain to you momentarily why I think this is significant in the context of King Lear. We see this. Okay, so let me try to explain why all of this matters. Why do the eggs matter? Why all the physics matter? Why is this significant for the play? So, as I mentioned earlier, when I was giving a kind of gloss on my broad interpretation of the play, I suggested that I think that at least part of the tragedy is rooted in a misunderstanding of nature. And at the outset of the play, I also suggested it looks as though Lear himself seems to be adopting something like an atomistic account, an atomistic philosophy. He seems to think that nothing will come out of nothing, but I think as his actions also show, he seems to take for granted that something will always be there to support the perpetuation of his kingdom. As his kingdom falls apart and he moves through the play, I think he starts to try to investigate the foundation on which his kingdom stands. And he also tries to understand the extent to which nature supports human civilization and human life simply. We see this, I think, pretty acutely in the face of the storm, when Lear starts his wild inquiry to try to determine the ways that nature seems to support life simply. And this quote is on your handout. When he's out in the storm, he's talking to Edgar, and he regards Edgar as, he seems to regard him as a philosopher. He also calls him an Athenian and a Theban, maybe thinking of him as similar to other characters we have met from time to time. But he asks Edgar in this context, "Is man no more than this? Consider him well. Thou owest the worm no silk, the beast no hide, the sheep no wool, the cat no perfume. Ha! There's threons are sophisticated. Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art. Off, you lendings, come unbutton here." And at this point, Lear disrobes himself as if to take on the experiment himself, to see what human beings are independently of the arts that allow them basic survival. He also talks extensively of the cold and the heat, and we hear about this throughout the play. So he seems to be interested in questions about heat and whether or not, and how far heat is essential for human life. While he's trying to come to terms with nature itself and whether it supports human life, Lear also is angry at nature. He rages at nature. I've mentioned already that Lear has a lot of eggs in it. And this is one of the places where we see the recurrence of eggs again and again. Okay, so when Lear is giving up his kingdom, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me just take a step back. Okay, so Lear is investigating whether nature supports human life. And he also becomes quite angered at nature itself and swears at it. And I will get to that momentarily. But before he gets to that point, we have one of these situations where we have an allusion to eggs. And it seems like Lear somehow misunderstands something about how eggs work This is in the context of an exchange with a fool, and this is on your handout. When Lear is talking with the fool, and he's already exiled, the fool says the following: "Nuncle, give me an egg, and I will give thee 2 crowns. What 2 crowns shall they be? Why, after I have cut the egg in the middle and eat up the meat, the 2 crowns of the egg." The fool goes on to say that Lear has split up his kingdom and let the golden part go, effectively leaving nothing in the middle. I think that the allusion to eggs here and the way that it combines this idea that Lear has left nothing in the wake of his kingdom, nothing to pass it on, I think that it shows that the way that Lear intends to pass on his kingdom across generations seems to be somehow faulty. In his strange view of nothingness, Lear seems to fail to understand how to support the continuity of life. And his failure seems to have something to do with a failure to understand the nature of biological generation, which doesn't fit straightforwardly into an atomistic paradigm. In addition to this theme of eggs that I've talked about a little bit, we hear a number of other places where Lear seems to be railing at the world of biological generation. Early on in the play, when Regan has exiled him or not permitted him in her home anymore, he curses her and he says, "Hear nature, hear, dear goddess, hear. Suspend thy purpose if thou didst intend to make this creature fruitful. Into her womb convey sterility. Dry up in her the organs of increase, and from her derogate body never spring a babe to honor her. If she must teem, create her child of spleen, that it may live and be a thwart, disnatured torment to her. Let it stamp wrinkles in her brow of youth, with cadent tears fret channels in her cheeks, turn all her mother's pains and benefits to laughter and contempt, that she may feel how sharper than a serpent's tooth is to have a thankless child." In the storm scene, when Lear is railing at the storm, he also calls for the destruction of the pregnant earth. And he says he wants all germs of life to be destroyed. In the famous speech there, "Blow winds and crack your cheeks, rage, blow. You cataracts and hurricanes spout, till you have drenched our steeples, drowned the cocks. You sulphurous and thought-executing fires, vaunt couriers of oak-cleaving thunderbolts, singe my white head. And thou, all shaking thunder, smite flat the thick rotundity of the world, crack nature's molds, all garments spill at once that make ingrateful man." I think what's really striking about both of these curses is that it ends in anger about filial ingratitude. It seems that Lear is angered at the realization that filial ingratitude does not come spontaneously out of nature. It does not come by necessity. So it seems there like Lear is missing something about the way in which nature must be cultivated in order that filial ingratitude be an essential part of generational transition. I think the most profound instance of Lear failing to understand something about life and the basis of human life appears in the final scene of the play when Lear arrives on stage with the dead Cordelia. In that context, Lear first appears and he announces that Lear is dead, and he actually adds his certainty that she's dead. He says, "I know when one is dead and when one lives. She's as dead as earth." But strangely, he immediately reverses his judgment, and he asks for a looking glass to see if he can observe any breath. Right after this, he tries another course. He looks for motion of the air that will cause a feather to stir. So he seems to almost be using these experimental tools to observe things that he can't see, the condensation of breath, the motion of breath, even when air seems to be nothing. So Shakespeare seems to suggest that even in this last context, Lear is still searching for ways to understand life. Now, when I say this, I don't mean to suggest that Lear is simply conducting experiments at this excruciatingly poignant moment in the play. I don't think that he is simply looking for signs of breath to test whether Cordelia is alive or not. I think Lear is looking for signs of something else, more figurative. I think tragically he might be looking for a sign of moral life in the midst of the political power vacuum that has destroyed his whole line. In general, it seems like the central feeling here is that Lear really doesn't understand quite in the way that nature generates, and also that it must be cultivated in order to support gratitude and also human civilization simply. Lear is often regarded as Shakespeare's most tragic of his tragedies, and I think that when we enter into these philosophical explorations of nothingness and atomism that it inspires, we start to see more deeply why this is the case. At the end of the play, the direct continuity of the kingdom is completely gone. There are no women alive on the stage, and in fact, their bodies are typically displayed on the stage. In light of the exploration of nothingness that appears in the storm scene, especially with its relationship to questions about what supports human life altogether, Shakespeare seems to point to the possibility not only of civilizational death, but of human annihilation simply. And I think this is one of the reasons why we feel the tragedy of Lear so acutely. When we begin to entertain this world of atoms and void, we begin to lose sight of some of the ways in which natural generation permits human continuity if we cultivate it in the ways that Lear suggests we must. So I think that for Shakespeare, the scientific theories that he explores lead his heroes to entertain something like a more phenomenological foundation for civilizational continuity. Hamlet points to recollection as the moving force for navigating an equivocal world. And Lear points beyond atoms and nothingness to a world that cultivates human life as it emerges from nature. The scientific frames, I think, show us that Shakespeare is aware that new cosmological conflicts resituate human beings in the world and put pressures on the moral universe to continually renew the ideas that support civilizational continuity. Thank you.